I have just showing change over time in the percentage of underrepresented minority students. Unfortunately, the iPads, the data that I use, they changed how they classify race such that the figures before 2010-11 are not comparable to those after. So I can only show a few years, but generally we see kind of I show the solid line for freshmen and the dotted line for undergraduate. So the freshman percent of underrepresented minority, we see kind of, in general, a very modest uptick. One that modest uptick is not matching the demographic trends in the percent of underrepresented minority high school students, for instance, which is growing at a much more rapid rate. We can look at the numbers for individual UC campuses, and we can see certainly very large disparities. We don't see that much movement over time. It's a small time period, but we certainly see very large disparities across UC campuses. With Merced having 60% of freshmen that are underrepresented minority students. So there's big differences in UC campuses there. So now sort of that's all long context comparing UC to national non-resident enrollment trends. So first, the first I have change over time in tuition and mandatory fees, and I show resident tuition and mandatory fees and non-resident. We generally see for all very high research universities just an upward trend in both, but a stronger upward trend in non-resident fees. Comparing that to the average for the UC system as a whole, we see resident tuition rising, non-resident tuition rising even faster. And if we look at the specific universities on the next page, the prices for non-resident are generally the same across campuses. The only difference is mandatory fees. But the UC system has increased non-resident tuition price much more than other public university systems, I think, in part because the University of California system enjoys such strong demand by potential out-of-state students, whereas University of Arizona, where I'm at, we target specifically to students that didn't get into a UC and are deciding between a CSU and going to an out-of-state school. And we charge much lower rates for out-of-state enrollment because we're not quite as competitive. So this is part of how this market for non-resident students works. It's a very competitive national market where basically every state outside of California is all trying to get California students to go to their state school, and we're competing with Oregon, UC Boulder, other state universities in terms of trying to capture these students. And we have a financial aid system that's targeted specifically at doing this. So this is a very serious enterprise and a national market. We next get to actual non-resident freshmen and non-resident versus resident enrollment. Okay, and so we have in this chart, the darker line is non-resident enrollment, and we can see kind of a gradual increase over time for very high research universities, with a kind of somewhat stronger increase going from 2008 to 2012. Looking at the UC system, they had the mean UC campus had much fewer non-resident freshmen than other comparable public universities outside of California, and it was only in like 2008, 2010 where you start to see a larger uptick. And so this is freshman enrollment by what kind of tuition they pay. So sometimes there's a a reciprocity agreement between states, and so if someone from another state would pay resident tuition, so this is counting the number of students that pay non-resident tuition. If we look at the next page, we see looking at the numbers specifically for the individual UC campuses. For Berkeley, UCLA, and San Diego, you see a very dramatic increase in non-resident students that I won't belabor because people have already talked about that. But generally, these campuses have restricted resident enrollment growth relative to non-resident enrollment growth, and more recently we see growth from Irvine and Davis. The next slide is again non-resident versus resident freshmen, but it's showing just by place of origin rather than what tuition rate they pay. And the reason I want to show that is because that allows me to isolate domestic out-of-state students from international out-of-state students. So at the very bottom line for very high research universities, we see in general for the mean very high research university, relatively low international student enrollment. I know this is kind of hard to see not being in color, but international student enrollment is kind of the bottom level. And we see that for the California system, the uptick in non-resident enrollment overall is largely is to a much larger extent than other universities in other states focused on international student enrollment. So if I look at the numbers for specific campuses, we can see I break out for each campus non-resident enrollment in the U.S. from non-resident enrollment international. So UCLA going from 47 in 2001 academic year to 1,052 in the 2012-13 academic year. And that is the lion's share of their non-resident enrollment. And that's, I know this from a national perspective, that's pretty unique. Most comparable public research universities are getting their out-of-state students domestically. Okay, and the final figure that I'll show you is it's a little bit hard to read, but this is just a table of the data I've showed you before is from institution level data from the federal government. This table is from student level data from the National Post-Secondary Student Aid Study. And it shows differences in between resident and non-resident in how much institutional financial aid they get, how much net tuition revenue they generate, their SAT scores, family income, percent Pell, parental education, race, etc. And so the general story, if you focus on that middle column, that's going to be most close to the UC system. This is public research universities categorized in the top 100 of U.S. News and World Report. And so generally, these non-resident students, they get higher SAT, ACT scores on average, higher family income, much lower percent Pell, much higher parental education. For instance, 50% of their parents having a graduate degree. And then the racial dynamics, interestingly, resident students are more likely to be white than non-resident students in this for this group of institutions, and non-resident students were much more likely to be Asian. But notice that non-resident students were also they were less likely to be Black and Hispanic. So generally, when an institution increases the share of non-resident students, it's increasing the share of affluent and white and Asian students over low income Black and Latino students. Okay, so that's all the tables and data I'm going to show. I will briefly review what the empirical research has to say, and then I will conclude. So that when empirical research, this is research usually done using regression modeling, and controlling for a lot of variables, trying to find a causal effect. So a study that I had published with Brad Kurz from University of Missouri, that when state appropriations decline, unsurprisingly, non-resident enrollment goes up. And this was actually a very strong result, and it was stronger at research universities than it was at non-research universities, and it was stronger at prestigious research universities. And an implication there, I think, is that when the state decreases funding for an organization, that organization looks for other. This is just general organizational theory. I study organizational behavior. Generally, organizations are sort of beholden to those who pay them. And when an organization ceases to pay you, you look for another master to help you earn a living by. And so now these public universities are going after non-resident students, and I call the title of that paper "Creating the Out-of-State University." And I think when the state appropriations are declining, the mission of the public university becomes unmoored from the mission of serving the state, and one begins to wonder, what mission are they pursuing now? Is it purely prestige? What is the mission? And so that's an empirical finding I get. Non-resident enrollment goes up. We see that public universities generally and historically practice admissions preferences for resident students. So when what I mean by that is when you've got two equal candidates, a resident or non-resident, who's going to get the nod? Historically, the resident student gets the nod, and that is a nod to the state funding that is provided and the mission to serve the state. But this Kristen Cummings, a master's student of mine who just finished her master's thesis, she finds, using more recent data, that as state appropriations decline, that admissions preference for resident students decreases to the point at which there is no preference. When I was applying to college, there was no way I was going to get into the University of Michigan because they were only going to let me in if I was much better than Michigan residents. Now that is less the case. So another study that is forthcoming is that I found that growth in the share of non-resident students is associated with declining share of low-income and underrepresented minority students. So the socioeconomic and racial composition of universities change when we become more out of state, and there's a lot of research showing that the racial and socioeconomic composition of the student body has a big effects on the experiences that students have. Students that feel racially isolated have when there's fewer students that are of their own race or fewer underrepresented minority students, they report more instances of racial violence, more instances of stereotype threat, and it's generally associated with worse outcomes for these students. And similar for low SES students, for low-income students, they experience negative consequences from feeling like they're the poor kid in school. So that's something I think is important to consider. And I found that the relationship between share non-resident and the share of the socioeconomic and racial composition, that relationship is much stronger at high prestigious schools and in states that ban affirmative action. So if you're in a state that bans affirmative action, if you go increase your share of non-resident students, that's going to have a stronger negative effect on the share of underrepresented minority students. So the University of California fits all of these criteria. So moving aside to some kind of different issues, there's economists who say, like, what is economically rational for the state, according to a rationality that not everyone would agree with, but Groen was looking at is if someone goes to school in a state, are they likely to stay there and work? So does it benefit a state to keep their own residents, and does it benefit a state to kind of attract the residents of other states? He finds that the relationship is modest, and so I can't say too much one way or another, and also that's old data that probably doesn't hold for California. California is unique in that California doesn't have difficulty attracting people to the state who are high achieving, and you can attract people to college and they're likely to stay there because there are jobs, and even if they didn't go to college there, they're likely to want to come to California. So California is unique in that, and if you're making decisions about are the students who leave California for college, are they going to come back, and decisions about what if we take another student in from another state, are they going to stay? I would not base your assessment on other states, because I think California is unique in those respects. There's also literature on what reduces out migration. So what reduces the number of students who are leaving your state to go elsewhere? Higher state appropriations reduce students leaving your state, as do state merit aid, but there has not been a similar effect for need-based aid. So state need-based aid increases the number of students going to college, but it doesn't decrease the number of students that leave your state. And that makes sense because students that are going to benefit from need-based aid, they're not the students that are thinking of going out of state as their option. At University of Arizona, we're targeting students who don't need need-based aid, who didn't get into a UC, and we want to say, hey, come to University of Arizona instead of a CSU. That's how we market ourselves to California and other residents. Okay, so getting back to the policy concerns, what can we say about some of the policy questions that I raised in the beginning? Does non-resident enrollment growth at UC campuses crowd out opportunities for in-state students? My co-author and I are in the middle of research on this, and I don't have firm results yet. If the total pie of students is fixed, if you're not increasing the total number of students and you increase the number of non-resident, then necessarily the number of resident will decrease. If the pie is not fixed, then there's not necessarily have one more non-resident, you have one less resident. So it depends on how the system wants to grow. Recently, the system as a whole has decided to, it seems decided to not grow as a whole, but to grow non-resident. So just simple math is that there's less spots for resident students. And I think other states that I've seen, their strategy has been more to grow residents slowly and grow non-resident quickly, so they can say to the state, hey, we're still growing resident. They don't want to get into that conversation. That's just a strategy I've seen other states adopt. But we don't have compelling evidence about that question yet. We do know that non-resident enrollment growth changes the socioeconomic and racial composition of campuses, and I think that has implications for student experiences. We don't know, I don't have great evidence about what are campuses doing with tuition revenue from non-resident students. If this is really a substitute for state appropriations, and so I think this money could be put to good use. And I certainly, the thing that makes this issue so interesting is it's not like smoking that's just unequivocally bad. I'm very interested in this issue, but I ultimately feel ambivalent because I could see that it's necessary to do this. If you want to pay for student services, you need tuition revenue to do it. But that all depends. Is that money being used for financial aid, for need-based? Is it being used at some campuses? I haven't seen this at UC, but at some campuses are building, luxury pools with water slides that are meant to attract high-income students to go there to go high-income out-of-state students. So I think you really want to understand, how is this money being allocated? What happens to low-income California students that are denied access to UC? What is the effect on that for those students? How does that affect their achievement? I think there's research that could be done there, and we'd want to know, do California students who leave, do they come back? What about the students who come here for out of state? Do they stay? So the final slide. I think, I hope it's been provided some useful information. I think if you're making policy decisions in the future and you have somewhat of a longer time frame, I think it would be beneficial to try to get some more evidence about policy questions that you have. For instance, College Board and ACT, it has data on every student who took the SAT or ACT, what their score is. It's got some demographic information, where they sent their scores. The National Student Clearinghouse has data on where every student actually went. The Common Application has data on where students applied if they use the Common Application. Now, as a researcher, I would love to get my hands on this stuff, but I could not get my hands on this stuff at all. States can, and with data like that, you would know, okay, UC students who apply, California students who apply to UC and don't get in, who are low income, what happens to them? California students who apply to UC and are high income and don't get in, where do they go? What happens to the marginal student who doesn't get into UC versus the marginal student who does? There are data that can answer these questions, which I think are very important for policymaking, and the state has authority to request these data. And if you do get it, I'd be happy to analyze it. So that is all, and I'm happy to answer questions, and thank you very much for your time.